Hey, learn stuff. Hi, I'm Parker Dahl, and welcome to So What, a place where I ask the question that so many of my students want to ask. So what? I mean, who cares about boats anyways? If I was meant to travel across the sea, I would have gills. Today, we will discuss the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. And perhaps the first thing we need to talk about is the fact that there is no isolated period of history. The Renaissance will influence the Age of Exploration, and vice versa. What we will attempt is to be able to identify where these historical crossroads are and what impact they had on the wider world. That said, let's talk about some trade.
Hey, doll, did someone say trade?
Dude, really? Can't I just teach like once?
I'll tell you what. I'll trade you this one quarter if you can answer one question. Do we have a deal?
I have to know. Deal. What's the question?
So what? Ha ha! Got him again!
Yep. That's my fault. I should have seen that one coming.
But really, who cares about this? It's not like there are any lasting effects from these eras.
Interesting argument. I mean, you're wrong, but it is still interesting the degree to which you are in fact wrong. I will prove that you were wrong with 4 different claims. First, the rediscovery of ancient works changed Europeans' view of the world. Second, political centralization will be used to stabilize countries. Third, Europeans explore and settle overseas territories to expand the economy. And 4, a commercial revolution will start to shift European society. Are you ready? I don't think you are. First, the rediscovery of ancient works changed Europeans' worldview. When Petrarch discovers ancient texts from the Roman Empire, he becomes convinced that society has lost something. It is within the writings of the Roman leader, Cicero, that he develops the beginning of a new philosophy, humanism. Humanism is the belief that humans are the most important creatures to actually study. This ideology will spread throughout Europe, and at first it starts very small, just from person to person, and maybe that person tells another person. But as more people come to know it, it will expand. First into the visual arts, where the likes of Michelangelo, Raphael, and Titian will actually show humanism within their works. As artists create visual representations of humanism, it literally allows people to see the world in a new way. This ideology will then be mass-produced by writers like Erasmus, who is going to have his works printed in the printing press and then will be shared and spread across all of Europe. Not only is there development in people just learning about humanist ideals, but people are encouraged to learn about it for themselves. The very process that will come to define the Reformation. 2. Political centralization will be used to stabilize countries. If there's one thing to remember about the late Middle Ages, it's that society was incredibly unstable. This made it difficult for most people to plan for their future. Machiavelli was a political advisor during the tumultuous shifts in power Italy frequently experienced. His book, The Prince, expresses the idea that a ruler should be judged on how effectively they stabilize their society. He famously stated that they should go beyond notions of a benevolent leader, for it is better to be feared than loved. A ruler can control fear with greater ease than they could love, but should also avoid being hated, because their main goal is to create a stable society and not spark a revolution. While it is unclear if some of the early new monarchs had read Machiavelli's The Prince, they certainly took his principles to heart.
I object! What do you know of monarchs? Well then, I withdraw my objection. You may continue.
In Spain, the marriage between Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile will create a cooperative reign that takes Spain from kind of a poor and warring country into the dominant force within Europe. It begins with the Reconquista of Granada in 1492. The unification of Spain won't be enough for these two rulers. They also want to purge Spain of any people that would question the legitimacy of their rule or of the Catholic faith. This is going to turn into the Spanish Inquisition, wherein new Christians are going to be sought after in order to figure out who is in fact someone anti-Christian and who is someone who is pro-Christian. And so they will target people of Jewish descent and later Islamic descent and interrogate them in very brutal ways until they confess to their crime, in which case they would then most likely be burned alive. In many ways, what this royal couple was doing is they were giving the people an enemy to target. They had someone that they needed to root out of society, but they also gave them a reminder that this is what happens when you push against the royal family, and you shouldn't even try. Similar practices will take place in England following the War of the Roses, although less religious persecution and more purges of the nobility. These actions will help create monarchies that are so strong that they start to have fairly stable societies, so much so that they start to look in different ways to innovate and create booming economies. And some of these countries have so much power that they feel that no person can actually speak up and tell them what to do, not even the Pope. 3. Europeans explore and settle overseas territories to expand the economy. As the Spanish monarchs will unify Spain, they will try to capture a piece of that spice trade. In the wake of the Byzantine Empire's defeat and the fall of Constantinople, European countries will find themselves virtually cut off from the traditional trade corridor of the Silk Road. Portugal will fund navigation efforts to map Africa's coastline in order to find a passage to India. In 1498, Vasco da Gama will be the first explorer to link Portugal to the spice trade by sea. While Portugal was focused on this means of exploration, they turned away from an explorer called Columbus, who wanted to sail directly west to get to India. In 1492, as the Spanish monarchs are finishing the Reconquista, they will fund Columbus's endeavor. While Columbus will end up failing in his endeavor to link Spain to the spice trade, in many ways his voyage is far more impactful. Columbus will connect the Old World to the so-called New World, and in doing so, these worlds are going to collide in a way that is both destructive and history-shifting, with disease that is spread from the Old World to the New World and kills anywhere between 80 to 95% of all indigenous people within that New World. That's going to have a big impact. Not just for the loss of life, which should be seen in its own right, but also because of the claims that Europeans are going to make on the New World and the conquests they're going to seek. If they had to face a fully prepared, fully armed indigenous peoples, they likely would have lost. But since their people are so devastated by these diseases, it makes that way more possible. And in fact, it's probably the only reason why they were able to be successful. Not to mention that, again, from this Columbian exchange, Europeans will bring with them giant beasts like horses that make travel extremely easy and allow for them to work in the fields. Another tool they were utilized in conquest, but then also in settlement. And lastly, the sharing of different foods between continents is likely going to benefit Europeans most, because they are the ones that really needed high-calorie foods that they just simply couldn't grow. But all of a sudden, you have different foods, like potatoes, and to a lesser extent corn, that are going to be sent to the Old World that they can grow in abundance, but also don't need to eat a whole lot of because they're so rich in calories. Now, you have whole populations that have a stable food source, so they don't worry about starvation. In fact, historians will argue that the potato will in fact put an end to the idea of famine and will stabilize European populations, which will in turn give them an advantage in industrialization from 1750 to 1950. And 4, a commercial revolution will start to shift European society. As the Spanish conquest of the New World will continue, it started to yield results that were beneficial for the Spanish economy. Gold and silver were still pouring out of the New World and into Spain, taking Spain from a relatively poor country to the wealthiest country within Europe, basically overnight. Only problem is, mining silver is extremely dangerous, but the Spanish had a resolution for this. They forced native peoples to mine for them. Only problem with this, the native people were dying at alarming rates, which was likely mostly due to the fact that there was a lot more integration with Europeans, which meant that disease was more likely to spread. Now, to be clear, most of the Spanish weren't necessarily concerned for native peoples out of humanity. They were worried because it cut into the bottom line, or their money. But there were people like De las Casas, who is going to argue that what they're doing is a violation of what we now know are human rights. And he pushes so hard and is so convincing, and is convincing on the economic front as well, that the king will in fact make it illegal to force native peoples into labor like that. But at the same time, the Spanish will then introduce a new free labor system. They'll start taking slaves from Africa into the New World to do some of these labor-intensive works for them. So as we see a diminishment in the use of indigenous peoples for labor, we will see an extreme rise in the use of African peoples for that labor. Now, things didn't just go all hunky-dory for the Spanish. You see, as they kept taking mass amounts of that silver and gold out of the New World and kept putting it into Spain and then using it to purchase different things, they didn't account for something, because this has never happened before. But inflation happened on a scale that no one had ever seen. Inflation is this idea that money becomes less valuable because, well, you just have more of it. So if more silver is being poured into the economy and it's working its way through the system, then that means that there's just more wealth in general. So people saw an incredible rise in the price of products. Not just manufactured goods either, food as well. And this started to hurt the Spanish economy, because all the gold and silver in the world is great, but if there are only 5 apples to buy, then there's only 5 apples to buy, and those prices are going to skyrocket. So you need to solve the supply side of that as well. There's evidence to suggest that this deflating economy is actually going to cause people to delay having children, and thus the population is actually going to start to decline. While this seems extreme, there's a lot to say that this actually helps stabilize the population within Europe, which gets to those benefits already talked about earlier in terms of having a more stable population for that industrial revolution, which of course comes much later.
Okay, I get it. This stuff is mildly interesting, but you talk about these European countries as if everything just sort of went their way.
I literally just talked about inflation in Spain due to the overproduction of precious metals.
Yes, but other than that.
Well, to be perfectly honest, a lot of the success at this time, from the perspective of Europeans, will really be attributed to 2 different things. And first is going to be the fact that they have advanced technology. Weapons, sure, but primarily ways of navigation. And the second, they got really lucky.
Luck! What a cop-out!
Fine. You want to hear about an instance where exploration didn't work out? Our tale takes place in the year 1587, in modern-day North Carolina, where Walter Raleigh will attempt to re-establish the first English settlement in North America. These settlers were part of a new endeavor to create a foothold for the English Empire to expand. Their task was simple: survive until the settlement could grow. Over the course of the summer, the colony found that might be more difficult than they previously expected. The soil was not yielding good returns, the water was brackish, and the colony feared that they had angered local native tribes to the point to where they might attack. At the end of the summer, the colonists convinced Raleigh to return back to England and plead for help from the Queen. He promised that as soon as he returned to England, he would send a new vessel carrying supplies and reinforcements. Raleigh would return to England, only to find that England was anticipating an attack from the Spanish Armada, and he was not allowed to sail back to his desperate colony. See, initially, Elizabeth will grant him an exemption so that he may return to the New World. But winds will delay Raleigh from setting out so long, actually, that by the time it becomes favorable for him to sail, the Spanish Armada is upon England, and Raleigh has to fight. This will delay him further. Eventually, another year out, they're able to send a ship with supplies to North America. But when that ship is En route, it is attacked by French pirates, who loot the supplies, so the ship must return to England. In 1590, a fleet will attempt to make contact with Roanoke again, this time sending more supplies and more people. Nearly 3 years after Raleigh's departure, this fleet will actually arrive at Roanoke. And what they find is curious. For on the beach, they find fresh footprints, but nobody meets them. They then venture up to the fort and find that it looks like it's in disrepair. First, carved onto a post is a word, Croatoan. And when they go inside, they find that all of the belongings have been rummaged through, the home's empty, and it looks like it's been deserted for some time. The common story was that the people were attacked by the native tribes. But if that were true, then why didn't they find a single body? In fact, not one of the nearly 100 settlers that were left behind will ever be seen again, nor will their remains. This is a mystery that eludes people even to this day. However, there are some theories as to what befell the lost Roanoke colony. First is that perhaps the people actually made nice with the Native American tribes and integrated into them. But if that were true, then why weren't they around to tell the English about that? The second was that perhaps they attempted to return to England. There was a ship that was left behind, and 3 years is a long time to wait, so what if they simply tried to sail and were lost at sea? We may never know. And third, there's this idea that perhaps there was a conspiracy against Raleigh. Maybe the reason they sent him back to England was because he was the problem, and as soon as he left, they deserted the colony, venturing off who knows where. One thing is certain, Roanoke will be a reminder to all of those who seek to go to the New World to find riches, that once ventured into that new land, you're more likely to disappear and never be seen again. Spooky Friday.
Here's your quarter.
Whoa, that was dark. But it's also a good reminder that life wasn't just perfect, and that everything Europeans didn't just work out for them. In fact, there were a lot of mistakes and bumps in the road along the way. More to the point, the life of the average European didn't change all that much. They'll start the Renaissance very dependent on agriculture, and they'll end the Renaissance and Age of Exploration still very dependent on agriculture and living in rural areas. But what we see with the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration, we're beginning to see where some of those crossroads of history link up. Thank you, and have a great day.
Spooky Dawn was even more entertaining. I've created a monster.